Professor Bart Kay. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So you have a degree, I believe, in something like nutrition science, or I've got that wrong. Just correct me. What's your?
Yeah, I have a number of advanced research degrees that I've picked up over the years. I changed direction in my academic career several times and needed to upskill with another degree. So I started out with the physiology of rest and exercise. In other words, sports science, exercise physiology. Then about 10 years into that career, I decided I was going to specialize in human nutrition. So I went and did some of that. And then in the last 5 years or so of my academic career, I decided I wanted to be a cardiovascular pathophysiologist. So heart disease, atherosclerosis, what causes that, what doesn't, all of that. So those are kind of my areas, along with pure and applied statistics, statistical inference, and research methods and ethics and all of that kind of malarkey. So that's kind of where I come from.
That's a fascinating mix. So what strikes out, I mean, a number of things strike out from that academic career, but one thing that strikes me is that you would have studied nutrition at a time when nobody was talking about ketogenic diets, let alone carnivore diets.
That's right.
Where you've ended up.
Yes.
So how did that happen?
Well, I played the game. I sat through the qualification. I told them what they wanted to hear. But all along, I knew full well that everything they were saying was demonstrably absolutely false. They were saying saturated fat causes heart disease. No, it doesn't. They were saying cholesterol is bad for you. Well, no, it isn't. They were saying you must have fibre in your diet. Well, no, you don't, etc. I could go on all day about that topic alone. But at that time, I needed to get the qualification so that I would have the credence to be able to lecture that topic. Whereupon, actually, when you stand up in front of a group of students in a lecture theatre, in most countries, there is a law that protects one's academic freedom and one's capacity to stand up and say whatever one sees fit, actually, to a group of students, whether it's popular or not. And then that leads me to a conflict with management because they have things called curriculum documents where they say, we need you to stand up and say saturated fat is bad. And I turn around and say, I'm not going to say that because it isn't so. It's false. Here is the evidence that it's false, etc. So I played the game to get qualified to do the job, then started doing the job, then ran into troubles doing the job, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it especially makes a lot of sense given what I know now. But, I imagine that if I had run into you in class, whenever it would have been 10, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have agreed with you at all. I started about myself as I want to call myself a victim of the propaganda, but I earnestly believe that, vegetarian and vegan diets were the way to go and so on. So how did you, were you just, I still don't quite understand what is it that caused you, as a kind of a salmon to be swimming the wrong way down the river, or whatever it may be? What made you swim upstream against the current?
I think it's hardwired. I really do. I have a so-called mild form of autism called, what do they call it now? They call it pathological demand avoidance syndrome. Now, I've only got a problem with 50% of those words. And it's the ones that bracket it. It's pathological and syndrome. It's just demand avoidance. If you tell me this must be done in that fashion, you can bet your bottom dollar I'm going to do it a different way. It's just absolutely hardwired in my very being. I can't help myself. So if there is any way to find a fault with what is the accepted narrative, the accepted wisdom, I will find that fault.
So it's just by your nature to be cantankerous is what I'm hearing. And when you heard these things, you looked into it, you did your own research, and the things that were sort of true, you accepted to be true, but unfortunately most of it was not true.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it, pretty much. I mean, okay, first of all, something has to hit a hot button for me that doesn't sound like it makes sense. That doesn't sound right. That, tell me more about that. And when I was a student, asking questions of the lecturers, tell me more about that, were often frustrated with fluff, non-answers, misdirects, stuff that was like, well, hang on, I could either start the stand-up brawl in class with the lecturer, or I could go, okay, fine, you're doing your best. It's not good enough. I'll go and do my own research. So I did.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to spend too much time on this part of the conversation because I have an interview coming up with Belinda Fetke, who will no doubt give us her. She's done a lot of research into this. But how is it that you think? How did nutrition science get it so bad? How did mainstream nutrition science go off on such a bad foot?
Yeah, it's one of the areas that lends itself very, very fully to financial interests of various groups, various people that want to lobby various powers that be. There's a very powerful force that has not only a bottom right-hand corner in terms of money to subserve, but also an ideology. And that ideology even runs to the extreme of being a theology for a lot of people in and of itself. And in fact, there are several actual theologies that do buy into the ideology as well, particularly that one based around Loma Linda, for example. That's a clear example of a theological group who've taken on the ideology of veganism and vegetarianism and a want to steer people away from eating what is ostensibly the appropriate species-specific diet for a human being, and it is hypercarnivore. How is it wrong? How has it got wrong? It's got wrong because the science of human nutrition is absent. There is none. You cannot go to the peer-reviewed literature and find properly designed, properly randomized, properly powered, properly tenured, properly observed, disciplined metabolic ward lock-in studies of an interventional nature with human beings as the research subjects. You simply cannot do that work. It's not ethical, it's not practical, it's not financially viable. There is no way we will ever be able to establish irrefutably cause and effect. This aspect of diet causes this outcome, that aspect causes that. All we can ever do is look at associations between things. And that brings in the epidemiologists, because that's all the research, that's all we've got in terms of hard health outcomes in human beings, is epidemiology. And that's a whole nother can of worms in terms of how epidemiologists in human nutrition comport themselves, how they behave, the procedures they undertake, the statistical smoke mirrors, misdirect, look over there, shiny thing, the stuff they do to make what are ostensibly almost zero differentials look massive.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to reiterate what you said just in case anyone missed it. So what you're saying is that in order to really make conclusions about nutrition, we would have to do long-term, like 20, 30-year studies with either putting people in a metabolic ward or having someone follow them around with a pen and paper and note down everything that they're eating and to track outcomes. These kind of studies are extremely expensive and they're not practical and they're never going to happen. Some metabolic ward studies did happen ages ago, but maybe they were looking for the wrong things when they did those. There was the problems with those as well, right? I mean, I'm talking about Ansel Keys working with what are they called? Conscientious resistors to the war and so on.
Yeah.
But so given that that's not going to happen, what you have are these weird associational studies, which always have confounders. The most important confounders being the healthy user bias and maybe the unhealthy user bias as well.
Yeah.
Right. So have I got that more or less right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then you will
Fantastic.
also find that epidemiologists will invariably make several decisions in the way they talk about their data, which are absolutely, with malice aforethought, designed to mislead you. The first thing they will do is they will adjust their outcomes. Now, as a scientist, and a scientist with more than a quarter of a century of experience in science, doing science, publishing science papers, undertaking experiments, I can tell you that I'm pretty well qualified to comment on what scientists do. And here's basically what it is. What scientists do is they plan, design, and put together experimental interventional programs to inform on aspects of cause and effect in the real world. They then make observations under discipline and control, and they report what they observed. Pretty much. Here's what an epidemiologist does, at least, one in the area of human nutrition. Don't bother with controlling anything, because you can't anyway. So just let it be what it will be. Let people do what they're going to do. Let them smoke, let them drink, let them exercise more or less, let them get fat, let them be thin. Let them do what they will do. Just observe them, naturalistic observation, and collect all the data. Then adjust the data once you've collected it. In other words, take the data you've collected, screw it up, throw it over your right-hand shoulder into the ash can and say, I'm going to make up some other stuff instead that suits my ideology and suits my source of funding. As soon as you adjust an observation and report something other than what you actually observed, I'm sorry, you're not doing science. That's anti-science. That's propaganda.
To play devil's advocate for a moment, I mean, there are rules by which they claim that they are adjusting their data, right? So they'll say that we're going to try. For example, I mentioned the healthy user bias, right? So we know that. I mean, I don't know this for a fact because I don't have the data at the tip of my fingers, but I imagine that vegetarians are less likely to smoke. Let me put it that way, right? To be smokers than the general population.
Correct.
Yeah. And so if I have a population of smokers and a population of non-smokers, if I have a population of vegetarians and a population of omnivores, then I want to make the claim, that vegetarians are less likely to get lung cancer, then I clearly need to do something about this. If I'm a good epidemiologist, I need to acknowledge, well, smokers are definitely more likely to get lung cancer. We understand that. Mm-hmm. Yes. So I need to adjust the data with that in mind, right? So that's what a good epidemiologist would do, presumably, right?
Well, that's what they claim to be doing. That's what they claim to be the good procedure. The problem is this. The first thing that every scientist learns in the first half an hour of their first undergraduate degree, if they went to an even remotely reasonable school, is this. Association can not inform on causality, period. So when you adjust an outcome for multivariate regression, what you're doing is you're taking a whole bunch of associations and you're superimposing them all one upon the other, and you are claiming to be able to X out the causal influence of each one of those mathematically. That is impossible. It is a hard-baked outcome. For example, if I get lung cancer sometime in the next 5 years, is that because I used to smoke when I was a younger man? Or is that because of my diet? Or is it a combination of those two things? And if it is a combination of those two things, how exactly are you going to determine what the combination is in terms of the causal contributions of each of those things? Because I either do or don't get lung cancer. So tell me, how much of that was contributed to by what? It cannot be done. There is no way to do this. It's a smoke and mirrors approach. And the other thing, of course, is that multivariate regression makes a number of assumptions around it assumes that the various factors that you're putting into that sum do not share collinearity. Now, invariably, what you will also see is when you look at one of these adjustments, it'll go, we adjusted for this, that, the other thing, age, and this, that, and the other, blah, 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 blah. Well, age and dietary component X, whatever that might be, are absolutely collinear in terms of incidence of disease process and death. Because I think what you'll find if you look at any group of individuals is the older they get, the more of them have disease process and die. Now, is that because they are older, or is that because of how they are living? And if it's a combination of both of those things, please tell me how to calculate exactly which is which. It cannot be done. This is nonsense.
So what I'm hearing you say, Bart, is that epidemiology, perhaps in general, but certainly nutritional epidemiology, is kind of junk science pretty much across the board.
It's not junk science, it's anti-science. It is the furthest thing from science there is. It's not even remotely akin to science. It is a joke and it should stop.
Okay.
Now,
so then my next question will be... Sorry.
Let me finish off on that one. Epidemiology in other areas can be useful. Like, for example, epidemiology has been used to trace the source of an environmental toxin to where it came from. Sure, that can be done. And that's a useful, sensible use of a tool. To trace health outcomes as that relates to nutrition, that's not useful. That can't be done. That's junk science. So I'm not saying epidemiology is junk. I'm saying nutritional epidemiology is junk. Just wanted to make that clarification, that caveat.
Fair enough. And I mean, not to belabor this too much, but just to make one last point, which is that I think most, I'm not talking about epidemiologists because they're a special kind of crazy, but most nutrition researchers, right, in a general sense, would say, look, the purpose of epidemiology is to go out and help you formulate a hypothesis, which you can then test in more rigorous ways, right?
Yes.
And my problem then becomes, well, they only test the hypotheses that they already were biased to agree with. So if we look at the longest living populations at the moment, I mean, we have places like Hong Kong and many places in Japan that eat a hell of a lot of fish and a hell of a lot of, in Okinawa, it's a lot of pork. Yeah. And so no one's testing that hypothesis. No one seems to say that, the pork-based culture in Okinawa is why they live longer, or the meat-based culture in Hong Kong in general is why they're, I believe, last I checked, the oldest living population on the planet at the current moment, right? So, in other words, there's a bit of picking and choosing in terms of what hypotheses get tested further based on this massive epidemiological mess.
Yes. Plus, 98% of all researchers agree with their source of funding.
Maybe 100. I'm not. You might be underestimated there.
Maybe.
Yeah. So it's Upton Sinclair now, who said, a man, something to the effect of he's never gonna speak against the interests of his wallet, right?
Correct.
Human nature. So if I can shift gears then, so for you, epidemiology is sort of is nonsense. It's not even science. And the thing that we do have in biology then in terms of understanding the human animal, right? Human nutrition and so on. One tool that we have is then biochemistry.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit about, one important piece of this. Metabolism is a very, very complicated thing. And I don't think we can explain the whole process in the course of this short interview. But there is something called the Randall Cycle, which you have been instrumental in sort of bringing to the fore of these debates in keto and carnivore spaces and so on. And I wonder if you could explain to me exactly what the Randall Cycle is and why we should pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. The situation is that Sir Philip Randle proposed the existence of this aspect of human nutrition, human metabolic pathway called the Randall Cycle. He actually didn't call it the Randall Cycle. He called it the glycerol something cycle. Later on, it got named after him because it was him that proposed it by someone else, and it stuck, so it became the Randall Cycle. The issue with the Randall cycle, and the reason that almost nobody has ever heard of the Randall cycle, now this was done in the paper came out, I think, in 1963. So this is not new information. But the Randall cycle got swept under the carpet and got hidden from public view and was not taught in schools and was not being taught to students, precisely because what it says really destroys entirely everything that Ansel Keys had put together. And as such, Ansel Keys, having developed quite a power base by that stage, him and his cronies basically buried Randall and the Randall cycle under a pile of papers. It's never spoken about. It's never taught. It's not part of nutrition science. It's not even part of it. It's something that's been ignored. It's become this thing. Anyway, what is it?
Just as an aside, before you go on to finish that thought, so Ansel Keys was a pretty awful guy because it seems like all of his rivals over the years he tried to bury, right? There was a guy in England as well that he really, about the theory of someone who was arguing that it's actually the carbohydrates and the triglycerides that you need to worry about and not total cholesterol, right? So it seems like that was just his personality, that he was just out to bury anyone who he disagreed with.
Yeah, that, and there was a lot of money involved, and he was paid a lot of money to go the route he went, etc. And let's not forget, by the way, that Ansel Keys was a fish physiologist, not a nutritionist.
And an economist.
Well, that too. Yeah. But I mean, primarily that, his claim to fame in the sciences was he was into the physiology of cold water fish, not humans and not nutrition. And anyway, that's for another day. The Randall cycle, here's what it is. Basically, the first primary things that you need to understand, the underpinnings of the thing, are that glucose above a certain concentration is absolutely toxic. Glucose above a certain concentration damages tissues, it damages cells, it damages lipid rafts, it damages cell organelles. It's bad stuff. We don't want glucose damaging our important vital cells. If the cells of our body have sufficient energy in them to undertake the day-to-day business of a cell, what the last thing they want is then to have is a whole bunch of sugar pouring into that cell according to a concentration gradient under the influence of a lock and key mechanism, for example, insulin in the GLUT4 transporter. So if a cell becomes replete with energy, either in the form of fat or carbohydrate, or a mixture of both of those, to a certain level, then what that cell will do, and here's the analogy I use. A lot of people around about our age, Samir, will remember the old style door locks that you would put the key into, and you would turn the key slightly to stop someone putting a key in the other side of that lock and opening that lock. And if the key was not locked, or was, you could actually push the key on the inside out with the key from, you could do all of that. It's kind of like that. What happens is the cell on the inside goes, there's enough energy in this cell. We do not want any more glucose inside the cell because that would damage the workings of the cell. Let's lock the doors. And that's basically what the Randall cycle is. So of the three influences that will cause that door to lock on a cell, fat alone is the weakest activator of that mechanism. Carbohydrate alone is the second or middle most powerful activator of that lock mechanism. And any mixture of carbohydrate and fats is the single most powerful activator of that mechanism and will lock that door quicker and more fully, lasting longer than anything else of the other two. What that tells us is that a mixed macronutrient diet is absolutely contraindicated. Because when you lock that door, according to that Randall Cycle situation, the next thing that will happen absolutely is chronic systemic inflammation if that door stays locked too much of the time.
So let me just make sure that I've understood this correctly. So basically what you're describing is a concept that I've heard referred to as sort of energy toxicity, right?
Sure.
There's too much energy coming in. So we're generally talking about the postprandial phase. So someone has eaten a meal, and there's too much energy in the body, and the glucose in particular is toxic, although, as you say, fat can play a role in this as well. And so therefore, the important cells, so let's take a specific example. Let's say, I don't know, your liver cell, for example, your hepatic cell, is actually going to lock the door and say, okay, no more energy. We got way more than we need, and we don't need no more. The result is that sugar stays flowing in the blood, in the what's the technical term? In the periphery, or throughout the whole body, and leads to inflammation basically everywhere it touches. Everywhere, which is the whole body, basically.
Yeah.
Am I describing it more or less correctly?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the situation is that when you think about it like a complex, important, functional cell is to be protected, and if you're gonna have a sacrificial pawn, the sacrificial pawn is going to be the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the epithelial cells of the vascular tree, because all of those cells can be replaced much more easily, much more rapidly, on a much quicker turnaround. And so as we evolved as a species over the last at least 350,000 years, the availability to us of carbohydrate, and certainly carbohydrate in large boluses, was almost none. And so it was very, very rare that our body was challenged by a huge influx of glucose at any given time. So when it did happen, okay, that's what happened. The Randall cycle kicked in. It protected our cells from the damage that they would otherwise experience. And the red cells took the hit. No big deal, because it happened rarely. In modern society, we're doing it 5, 6, 7 times a day, every day of our stupid lives. We're pouring carbohydrates down our neck without let or hindrance. And the Randall cycle doors are being locked on our cells because of that. And when you do that, they'll remain locked for several hours before they unjam, if you like. And if you do that 3 and 4 and 5 times a day, you're causing 3 and 4 hours, 4 and 5 times over, of locked doors. Most of the time, those doors are locked. The Randall cycle is in effect. The inflammatory process is in effect. You are chronically systemically inflamed. Hello, most forms of cancer. Hello, atherosclerosis, heart disease. Hello, cerebrovascular accidents. Hello, type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes even can develop out of that. Obesiogenesis, the whole shooting box, everything, all the big killers. And they are all down to eating a macronutrient that is totally unnecessary and, in fact, contraindicated in the human diet, that being carbohydrates.
Yeah. What I like about this is that you're taking the biochemistry and turn it into sort of practical tips for living based on some understanding of human evolution as well. So I like this approach a lot. I guess I don't know if this is a nuance or complementary or what, but what I would say is that evolutionary speaking, there must have been times, like a specific time of the year that I'm thinking of. So, the late, depends on well, let's stick to the area of the world that I'm very familiar with, which is where humans evolved. So if we stick to the Southern African region, there was a specific time right around late summer, which in that part of the world is about February, March, where a lot of fruits are ripening at the same time. There is an abundance of prey There's just an abundance of food, and then a few months later, there's hardly any, or maybe 6 weeks later, there's hardly any food at all.
Yeah.
And so, is there not some evolutionary justification? I mean, there seems to be an evolutionary justification for overeating during a seasonal overeating,
Yes.
and then seasonal undereating, right? And so,
Yes.
wouldn't the Randall cycle have been activated maybe once a year or something like that for our ancestors in this way?
Yeah, pretty much that. I mean, the berries are ripened, the fruit is ripened, there's prey to be had, so you're having a mixture of fats and also of carbohydrates in the form of the fruit sugars and those kind of things. Absolutely activates the Randall cycle, causes you to put some fat on. If you were to, like, I mean, berries and that kind of 2, 3, 4 weeks a year that they're ripe and ready to go in the natural course of events, without shipping things in from overseas or without refrigeration or any of that kind of stuff. And that's what it was. And so we ate that sort of stuff. We put some fat on, which served us well over the winter when it was cold and there was nothing to eat. Absolutely. It makes perfect sense.
But the problem is that you can have access to the heydays of summer, in your fridge 24 hours a day if you want.
Yeah.
Or worse, going down to McDonald's or something.
Yeah.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff. You mentioned, the other thing I like about this is that it explains this term, sort of diseases of civilization, and gives it it's a very clearly linked to this, to a biochemical process, which is that you got too much energy. You got a surplus of energy and it becomes toxic, especially glucose becomes super toxic, and your body has ways of dealing with it, but it has ways of dealing with it in a short-term way. It doesn't have ways of dealing with it if you're going to expose yourself to that kind of inflammation for day after day, month after month, and so on.
Correct.
But let's move to something that you mentioned in passing, and that I think, certainly when I told my doctor that I was going to eat a purely carnivorous diet, which I did just to sort of wind him up a little bit, to be honest. I should have probably kept my mouth shut.
Good work.
The first thing that he said was, what about cholesterol?
Yep.
And so you mentioned that it's the inflammation that leads to heart disease and not necessarily the cholesterol.
Correct.
Can you walk us through that process in a little bit more detail?
Yeah. In order for atherosclerosis to begin to develop, there has to be an immune response, and there has to be an immune response to something that is off whack. Now, there's several things that get off whack that lead to the initiation of the process of atherosclerosis heart disease. And they are physical injury, physical damage to the epithelial linings of the high pressure side of the vascular tree. So we're talking inflammation, physical damage to the cellular linings, loosened gap junctions. We're talking a physical artifact, something actually physically going on here. Now, why do I say that is so? Well, it's so because if you look at the blood drawn from a vein, as opposed to the blood drawn from an artery, in the same person at the same time, it is the same blood. It contains the same cholesterol at the same concentration. Atherosclerosis heart disease never, ever occurs in veins. It's only ever in arteries. So right there, if you say cholesterol is the cause of atherosclerosis, right there I'm going to have to say, sorry, we're done. If it was, atherosclerosis would occur in veins as well. It does not, ever.
Now, I'm gonna interrupt you there for a second, because I had a debate with a guy called Nick Hebert some months ago, and when I put this kind of argument to him, he basically, like, the claim is not that his claim, not my claim. His claim is not that cholesterol causes heart, or that cholesterol is the only cause of heart disease. His claim is that there's like 20 different factors, of which cholesterol is one. In fact, it becomes such a weak claim that I found it very hard to debate with him, because it's like, dude, what are you saying exactly? Like you're saying that there's all these different factors. In fact, they're all correlations, aren't they? They're not actually.
Yeah.
At least there's no proof that there's this causation going on. So
Okay.
I don't think someone like him would find that argument convincing.
No. Okay. Well, what people that watch your channel and mine need to understand is that Nick Hebert, academically, is a boy in short pants. Nick Hebert is a youth hiding in his mum's basement would be the best analogy for him. He thinks himself to be awfully clever, but he is completely and utterly out of his depth. He has no idea what he's talking about, and actually no basis. He might have one or two peer-reviewed publications under his belt if he's lucky, actually. He has no advanced research degree of any kind, actually. He's a bloke that likes to make videos on YouTube. And he is an adherent to the High Church of Anorexia Vegana, and as such has absolutely no credibility of any kind for that very reason alone. So I wouldn't worry about anything Nick Hebert has to say on any topic whatsoever. What these boys do is they have a little gang, a little club that they hang around in their mummies' basements collectively online and talk to each other while they're eating their popcorn and whatever else. And they practice debate techniques. They practice this sophistry to try and tie people in knots rather than dealing with the actual science at hand. Nick Hebert has been challenged on more than one occasion to come and front up to me and see whether he can stay in the ring with me, and he doesn't have the courage to do it. He's wormed out of it, basically. And even went so far as to claim it was me worming out of a debate challenge from him. No, Nick, any day of the week, twice on Sundays, let's go. Goodness me. Anyway, so that's Nick Hebert in a nutshell. Right. So there is a role.
Sorry, let me remind you of where you were. Oh, you got your train of thought back?
I got it. I never lost my train. I just wanted to really make it very clear about Nick Hebert. So going back to the cholesterol thing, cholesterol has a role, potentially, and that's a word that you should use advisedly and with extreme caution in the atherosclerosis development. And the reason I say that is because actually it's not cholesterol that plays this proposed role that I'm going to talk about at all. It's actually a lipoprotein that carries it, which is not the same thing. A spade is a spade, and people who arrived on a bus are not the same thing as the bus that they arrived in. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, for your body to react negatively to this particular bus, this transporter for cholesterol, first of all, that bus has to be dinged up. And the way it gets dinged up is by being oxidized or damaged by, guess what? Glucose. Hello. So keep your glucose level under control, as you absolutely should. Keep your oxidation under control, as you absolutely should. Buses don't get dinged. Immune system doesn't suddenly start reacting to the buses negatively. Atherosclerosis does not occur irrespective of the concentration of buses or cholesterol being carried by buses. That's the simple, most parsimonious way of explaining that concept that I can muster in a few minutes.
No, it's fantastic stuff. It's fantastic stuff. So coming to the sort of practical part of the discussion. So, I mean, let me tell you how I'm beginning to put together the story, and you can correct me. We are all sort of the victims. I'm using the word victim perhaps more than I should, but we're all the victims of food cultures that have evolved to a greater or lesser extent to deal with times of scarcity, to deal with times of barely being able to survive, right?
Sure.
And if we look at some of the most notable, and I have a whole interview with some noted Indian nutritionists and food historians on how this story unfolded in India. but it unfolded in similar ways in other parts of the world. That there was people were basically made into slaves in different forms, either through colonialism or through kingdoms and so on. And one part of being a slave is that you don't get to eat really nice food, but being human, you have to sort of live with what you have and spice it up. And so as a result, I think we have food cultures that are really based around this combination. First of all, they're based around carbohydrates, but they're also based around a combination of carbohydrates and fats, because that's what was making us feel good. Because we couldn't, we being the plebes, the working classes in general, didn't have access to good quality nutrition. And unfortunately, now we have been so brainwashed in this these various food cultures of ours, that we now think that eating some of those plebe foods, or some of those foods that we were forced to eat because we didn't have a choice, is actually the healthiest way to eat. And given that context, given that culture, it becomes really, really tough to tell people, look, guys, all you got to do is eat more meat, and eat it maybe once a day, twice a day at the most. And that's really all. It's not rocket science here, right? But when I give that kind of message, people think I'm speaking Martian or something. Is that the same kind of picture that you're encountering?
Yeah, there is a huge countercurrent of disinformation out there, and it's people standing up on their hind legs and authoritatively, confidently claiming things to be so that absolutely are not so. And it's difficult for members of the public to be able to wade through this torrent of excrement to work out what is correct and valid and what isn't. And frankly, most of them don't have the inclination or energy to do so. And we have developed a society where, for some reason, scientists are put up on a pedestal and we're told to trust the science. You've got no hope of understanding this. It's well above your station. You just need to take my word for it. I'm the scientist, sort of thing. Well, hang on a minute. Questioning the science is precisely how you do science. Not deifying someone who says, I am the science, for example. Because anyone who says, I am the science, is not.
Yeah, that's too true. And that brings us to something that I'd like to just get your opinion on, because a lot of my work is talking about the difference between science and knowledge, especially when it comes to non-Western, non-sort of, the kind of cultures that didn't go to university, they don't go to university, but still have a lot of knowledge, in my opinion. And some of that, I think, is scientific knowledge. So, what, in your opinion, is there something unique about sort of the university as an institution, or as about Western science as a sort of field of study when compared with indigenous knowledge systems, or should these all just be judged on the same criteria? I think replicability being a sort of key criteria for understanding.
I think the single biggest factor that the more westernized cultural approaches have in this is a quite stunning degree of arrogance. Quite stunning degree of arrogance. And snotty little boys like the one we spoke about previously is a prime example of that. That is an example of Dunning-Kruger on feet. And for those who don't know, the Dunning-Kruger syndrome is someone who is so destitute of competence that they are unable to even grasp the level of their own incompetence. They think they're clever. And I think that pervades most of Western science. There seems to be a complete departure from the base disciplines of science. Anything that's too hard to do with discipline and do correctly, instead of saying, sorry, folks, we can't inform on that with science because it's unethical, impractical, impossible financially. We can't do it. Ergo, we can't possibly tell you what the best thing for you to be eating is. We can only, guess to the best of our ability based on associations. So long as we report what we actually observed instead of adjusting it. Instead of doing that, we say, we know everything there is to know about human nutrition. Trust the science. We are the science here. We're going to claim authority here. And not only are we going to do that, we're also going to try and silence anyone who says anything antithetical to what we have to say. Because they're doing damage to society, those people. Which is a great theory until you look at public health statistics and go, well, who is it that's doing damage? Incredible stuff.
Yeah, too true. So as we're wrapping up here, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you, not that, I don't think we all have to live perfect lives. let me give that a preface.
Oh, good.
But, let me just ask
I can breathe again.
just as a point of information, how is it that you are coping with these kind of things? What is it that you do? What's your daily diet look like? Are you on any kind of very strict regime, or just eat what you feel like? How does your life work?
Yeah, I run. I tend to run around about 95% carnivore in my intakes, and that's nominally by energy intake. If I'm going to transgress, it will be something like a glass of wine here and there. It will be the occasional bowl of blueberries with cream. Those kind of things. Certainly no vegetables. Certainly no wheat or grains or grass seed of any kind. No baked products, no manufactured products of any kind to speak of. Probably on a good day where I'm adherent to the 100% level, it's going to be the muscle meat. I don't eat organs, by the way. Muscle meat and associated fat of usually beef. Beef is about 80% of my intake. And the other 15% in total is made up of lamb, pork, chicken, fish, and other seafood, for example. But the vast majority of everything that goes in is beef and beef fat. I will add additional butter to taste. I salt everything to taste. That's about it. And I will eat once a day, usually around about 4 in the afternoon my time, certainly before the sun goes down if I can possibly arrange that.
Yeah.
And that's
you haven't died of scurvy, I see.
No, I haven't died of scurvy. I haven't died of any kind of deficiency syndrome either. Neither have I had constipation for 7.5 years. Neither is there any sign of bowel cancer or any of those other things that I would have got, absolutely on this carnivore diet, which is reckless and dangerous. And, I'm one of not only tens and hundreds of thousands, but probably millions now of N equals ones that all add up to, a lot of people say that anecdotes are not data. Well, actually, a bunch of anecdotes collected under some kind of discipline actually are data. That's what data is. So, we have data here. We don't have scientific data, but then neither does anyone antithetical to us. People that say we have all this data about human nutrition. No, you don't. Show me an experiment.
Yeah. Bart, for me as an ex-vegan health coach who now specializes in sort of keto and carnivore diets, a lot of people come to me and they ask, they're just afraid. I mean, they're not doing well. They come to me only when they have very serious health concerns. I wish they'd come to me earlier.
Yeah, me too.
Often their digestion is just completely shot. Yeah. But often they're just really, really afraid about making this kind of a change or any kind of a change. What would you say to such a person? someone who can see the academic merits in what we're discussing, but doesn't feel confident enough to make those changes? What would you say to such a person?
For me, it's quite simple. It's like, well, have a look at where you are now. Is that where you want to be? No. Well, let's try something different. It can't get that much worse, can it? It's like the adage with there was two old blokes sitting on a porch and there was a dog sitting on the porch howling. And one of the old blokes says to the other one, "The hell's wrong with your dog?" And he says, "Oh, he's sitting on a nail." And the other one says, "Well, why the hell doesn't he get off the nail?" He says, "Because it doesn't hurt that much." It's that exactly. If you are in a bad place, go somewhere else. Do something different. Someone has led you up the garden path. And if you are on a diet that avoids animal foods, prioritizes plant foods in any way, shape or form, you have been led up the garden path. That is not an appropriate diet for human beings. We have the absolute hard evidence of that in terms of the anthropology. We have the nitrogen and carbon isotope testing on human skeletal remains from humans who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, tens of thousands, a few thousand. We know what people ate, and we know, therefore, how their genes have been selected for and against. The answer is humans are obligate hypercarnivores. Fact. So are you, even if you don't like that fact. Sorry about that. Come and join the party. It's great over here. We have the best bowel function of our lives. We have the best health of our lives. It couldn't be better. It's the best thing to be doing, absolutely.
Fantastic stuff. Bart K., thank you so much for your time. I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
You bet. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.